Okay, hi. I'm going to do something, going to attempt something. I want to talk about what it was like in the 1980s. And I was just watching, for whatever it's worth, I was watching a fan reaction, well, not a fan reaction, but a first time reaction to Terminator 2 Judgment Day. And it came out in 1991. Now, I guess maybe it was when, see, one of them was showing it. She had seen it for the first time as a first time reaction on the channel, and now she was letting her friend see it for the first time. And in the introduction to it, the voiceover said in the year 1997, and the friend said, "Oh, that was before I was born," and that was probably when what got me thinking about time passing. And I grew up in the early to mid to late 1980s. I was born in 1975, the end of 1975, November, which is in the end of 1975, and that meant that in the middle of the 1980s, I was fully 10 years old, and there are a lot of millennials active now, and believe it or not, there's a time when millennials were the young kids. Now they're grown up and they have kids, Generation Z or Gen Z. And time capsules are very important. There's a Holocaust museum. There are other museums too where people record what things were like in their time. And I've seen on YouTube recordings of interviews with people who had seen, for example, the turn of the century, or just were born around the Civil War, believe it or not. And that's the advantage of modern technology. You can be able to record these things and hopefully preserve these things. So, and I had also been recording quite a few YouTube videos where I end up crying at the end, and but they were very heartfelt, and I'm glad that I put them on. This is recording, isn't it? It is recording. Okay, good. I want to simply talk and record my memories of what things were like. Not necessarily my own biography, my own autobiography, but simply what things were like from my own perspective as somebody, a child, growing up into 10 years old, midway through the 1980s, and then the late 1980s, in my tweens or early teens. What things were really like, what things were popular, not the skewed version that you may see later on where people try and rewrite history. But I want to tell you from firsthand experience. Okay. First of all, television, there were only three basic channels, and it wasn't like people didn't want other alternatives. A lot of stuff I will talk about will be, a lot of things I will talk about, please keep in mind, there were no alternatives. This is simply the way things were, and I tend to tilt. Anyway, the way things were, and that was just common, normal life. So there were three basic TV channels. NBC, you had local affiliates of NBC, ABC, and CBS. And then you typically had another channel which was Public Broadcasting System, or PBS. And then, in my experience as a child, you had TV sets which were not the flat screen. They were projection screen TV sets. They were large, more like a heavy box. Imagine lifting a heavy box, and somewhat delicate. I mean, they weren't extremely fragile, but it took a hefty, strong person to be able to lift it and put it down. Of course, there were smaller portable TVs with antennae and so forth, but I'm talking about normal TV in the living room. Typically, a family home would have a large a family TV set, and then in other rooms, a kid may have his own TV set on a table or something, and there would be a VHS player. Normally VHS. There was also Beta, but a video cassette player. VHS stands for Video Home Service or Video Home System, something like that. And that was a particular company. Its competitor was Beta. They were both forms of video cassette players. And there would typically be a cable box. Now you had to pay for the service of having cable. If you didn't pay for that, you could have the regular channels, NBC, CBS, and ABC, and PBS, and possibly, and there was maybe a UHF station. But those are the basic channels, and they were free. As long as you had a TV and it was plugged in, getting electricity, you did not have to pay for anything more. And but many times, many homes had a cable box, and they would subscribe to the local cable provider. Something, I guess, like today's internet service. You have Verizon and Time Warner and so forth for today's internet service. It was something like that back then. You had to find one that provided service in your area, but it was cable. And with cable, you had I wouldn't say oodles and oodles of channels, but you had I'm off the top of my head, I'd say maybe 20 or 30 channels, and that was it. And now this is more like the mid 1980s. And the newspaper would be delivered to your home, usually. And in the paper, I like to read the Sunday comic books, or the Sunday comics, which would be included in the Sunday edition. And along with the Sunday edition, you had a cable guide, a cable TV guide, and you'd see prominently at the top of a page of the cable guide, you'd see the basic channels. It would be a grid, and it would give the times going like this, like 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 8:30, 9 o'clock, 9:30, and so forth. And then along the side, it would give a listing of NBC, CBS, ABC, so forth. And then that would be the basic, labeled as something like basic. And then below that, you'd have the cable channels all listed in rows. And then beneath that, there were special channels extra channels you had to pay more for in addition to the regular cable service. And you could pick which one. In contrast to paying for cable, in which case you get all these channels in basic cable. The ones below that would be special channels you pay for individually. And those were, if I remember correctly, HBO, Cinemax, Showtime, Disney, probably missing a few in there, but I don't think so. Actually, I think the basic ones were HBO, Cinemax, Showtime, and Disney. And those primarily played movies. Their big contrast from the cable channels was that they played movies, and sort of almost first run. And first run in the sense that the movies had played in the theaters, and when they left the theaters, sometimes, especially when the popularity of video cassettes became stronger, more prominent, when video cassettes became more prominent, of movies became more prominent, the movies could be rented, not bought, but usually rented, although later on you could buy these movies. They would advertise movies on video cassette, and they were like $30 per movie, like per cassette, and they would just have one movie on the cassette. And in addition to the areas where you could simply rent the movie, I don't remember the prices, maybe $5 or $10 or something, and it was typically like, I think maybe rental for a day. I don't think they really rented for the week. I think it was basically a 1 or 2 day rental. And yes, you had to actually pay for the rental and you didn't really borrow them. and you had to bring them back. And there's the phrase "be kind, rewind," meaning you had to make sure that when you brought it back to the rental place that it was rewound, because it would save time on and labor on the people running the rental stores, that they wouldn't have to rewind all these returned cassettes themselves. So that's where the phrase "be kind, rewind" came from. And I would venture to say often there would be a charge or some kind of penalty if it wasn't rewound, and especially if it wasn't returned on time. It's like the library. So there would be late fees and so forth. So anyway, alongside that, there'd be an extra special excitement when a movie would now be available on one of those special premium, it's what they call them, premium channels, HBO, Cinemax, Showtime, and so forth. I don't remember exactly how they seemed individually, but I remember Cinemax was famous for late at night being called showing like more nudie or more raunchy stuff later at night. Skinaflix or whatever. I don't remember exactly what they got the reputation for being called. But anyway, that was in some sense the big thrill of having premium channels. You could be able to show nudity, and you could be able to show stuff that you couldn't show on the regular cable channels. And again, there weren't that many cable channels. I remember it was Nickelodeon, CW13. Although that may be just have been local. There was Nickelodeon, there was Black Entertainment Television, and a few other channels. There weren't that many. So I remember shopping malls were very big. I mean, they were basically the mainstay. I remember several malls in the area where I lived, and shoppers would just walk around and mingle, and the shopping malls were elegant. I remember like decoration in the decorative like palm trees in at least one of the malls. I remember another one was famous for its large clock, and people, often teenagers, but just people in general, would just walk around casually. It was like a park. And there were, of course, many stores. And I remember there were bookstores, there were video arcades. That was when I would go to a mall, one of the first things I would go to would be a video arcade. And you've probably seen video arcades before, video game consoles before. Typically, most of them would have, most of the games in there would be a stand-up cabinet style, where you were standing up and you were resting your arms on some kind of thing that, picture a block and then with a screen at about eye level, and then just about where your arms are, part of this block juts out, and you have a joystick, and you could hear all sorts of machine noises, and it was a kind of music to your ears, kind of to hear the familiar sounds of ding, 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 going on all around you. And that's where you'd have Pac-Man and Donkey Kong and Centipede and all sorts of different Battle Zone or whatever, all sorts of different games. And then there were bookstores, and a lot of time, and every mall must have had a toy store, at least one toy store. And the toy stores were organized differently from, I don't even see toy stores now to the extent that they were in the 1980s. But I remember going in, and it wasn't like a tumbleweed or ghost town or something. You would go in, it would be filled all, like, picture a huge room, long room, far, you could fill toys way in the back, all along the walls, and there were aisles of toys. And one section would be girls' toys. You'd see like Barbie and Cabbage Patch Kids and other kinds of toys. And there were knockoff toys of the more popular ones, like copycat versions of the more popular ones. And then probably right around the Barbie aisle, there would be boys' toys. They would be Transformers, GoBots. There was a big there's a big surge of different companies selling robots that could change and alter their shape into something, usually cars. The popular, well-known ones were, and the biggest ones, biggest ones taking up the aisles usually, were Transformers and GoBots and converters and so forth. And you can read more up on what they were. They were like Japanese imports that were branded by Hasbro and Tonka and so forth. But I want to emphasize that this wasn't just a few toys on a shelf or just dangling on a hanger or something. I mean, they were like the wall. You could just look all the way from one end of the store all the way to the other. Would be just a lineup of toys, shelving, horizontal shelving, boxes and boxes and boxes, neatly organized and stacked, and multiples of the same toy. You could look all the way down the aisle, and there were several aisles. You could turn around and see another aisle. And there were action figures. Action figures were very big, especially action figures modeled after famous movies. Star Wars was extremely popular. It had come out in 1977, and it wasn't until 1978 when you saw the first action figures. Typically an action figure, I mean, the packaging design may have varied, but typically you would have a cardboard, maybe a cardboard maybe about this size, well, maybe a bit smaller, a cardboard about this size. It would show in large letters the movie title, and then it would show like probably an image or photograph of the figure that you're buying, the character from the movie, and a little bit of a bubble of plastic would contain the action figure. And usually the action figure would come with a little miniature accessories like a pistol or a whip or some kind of gadget or something, cloak or something. And I remember G.I. Joe. I remember, although that was its own brand, but the ones, what you would see on the action figure in the action figure section would be G.I. Joe, Star Wars, oodles and oodles of Star Wars. They would be usually hung on a hook, all lined up, going back towards the wall, and there would be several hooks. And Kenner superpowers, these were action figure versions of Superman, Batman, Robin, the Flash, Green Lantern, and so forth. And they're each, as I said before, each toy line would be its individual lineup of characters. And in addition to the action figures, in terms of Star Wars, you also had boxes of play sets. Same thing with G.I. Joe. You'd have boxes of play sets, and there would be smaller, like mini play sets for people who could not necessarily afford the larger play sets, but could afford something, a smaller kind of play set to buy in addition to the action figures, so that the action figures can have some kind of play area to move around in. And all right, so let's go away from the toy. I just want to emphasize that the toy stores were filled with toys, and you had a toy store in and of itself, just filled with toys. It wasn't the toy store wasn't in some department store or whatever. It was just, you had tons of toy stores, and you also had movie theaters. Now, it was only until like 1990, maybe, or even after that, when I personally went into a movie theater that was huge and gigantic, and you had balcony seats and so forth. I simply remember movie theaters that were on the ground. I don't remember any balcony seats, and it wasn't like a circular dome or anything. It was just, or auditorium or whatever. It was just a large like quite a large room to fill a lot of people, but there were cushioned seats where the seat would typically fold up, like automatically, I guess spring action. It would just simply pop up if no one was sitting. There was no weight pushing it down, and people would make jokes about the spilled popcorn and spilled candy on the floor and so forth. And you would have a large screen, and it wasn't they weren't digitally presented. You had a projector somewhere up behind, like if I were sitting facing you and I'm facing the screen, way, 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 way back up somewhere, there would be a projectionist essentially looking through a window, and there would be a little projector shooting an image, projecting an image onto a screen, and there would be a little thing in the upper. Well, I don't know if I'm trying to put it in the. It would be in the upper right of the screen, and I didn't catch it until a projectionist friend of mine later on pointed it out to me when I was watching a movie at home that had been transferred onto DVD. There would be a little circle or something, a little notch in the upper right corner, and that was a signal to the projectionist that you only have a few seconds to switch over to the next reel. Actual movie film would be in rolls, rolled up, and it would be essentially spun through a projector at a fast enough speed so that it would give the illusion of, like a flip book, it would give the illusion of motion. Just individual pictures run through fast enough that your eye wouldn't sense them as individual pictures. It would give the illusion of motion. So the projectionist would have several reels, what were called reels, and that signal, that curlicue or notch or something in the upper right, would be a signal that you have to change over to the next reel within a few seconds. And it appeared first as a warning, and then it would appear a second time to signal now is the time to switch to the next reel. And you hear munching of popcorn, and there were some movies that were really popular, and I want to emphasize which ones were especially popular, because a lot of movies came out during the 1980s. I want to mention Ghostbusters was very popular. Gremlins came out, I think, the same week. Ghostbusters and Gremlins were huge. And before that, Return of the Jedi, when it came out in 1983. That was huge. Ghostbusters and Gremlins were the following year, 1984. That was huge. And I would venture to guess that there were more movies put out year by year then than there are now. And people talk now about special effects. Oh, it looks hokey. It doesn't look very good. Well, we didn't have CGI. We didn't have somebody's going to nitpick and say, oh, well, 1978 you had I'm not talking about specific bits of computer-generated imagery. I mean, you didn't have CGI to the level that you have now. You can thank George Lucas a lot for that. And I also want to say, in case I forget, George Lucas, in developing the first Star Wars movie, which came out in 1977, early 1977, he had to create his own special effects company. It was called George Lucas's Industrial Light and Magic, ILM, and they became so revolutionary in their methods. They revolutionized the entire industry, that they were called upon to do other movies as well. Some, I know for one instance, it was Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. They did, sorry, I'm itching, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and they did special effects. They were known as the big, I would venture to say they were known as the big heavy hitters for the #1 choice for special effects. And when Star Wars came out, it blew everything out of the water in terms of special effects. And then, really, I would say 1977, and that was a huge blockbuster. And I want to say, in terms of merchandising, what kinds of merchandising would be out for a popular movie? You'd have T-shirts, you'd have mugs, there wasn't the level of media that you have now, but you'd have certainly news blurbs probably talking about it. You'd have T-shirts and mugs. You'd have magazines out talking a specific. You'd have two kinds of types of magazines. You'd have like magazines just sort of for the general public, like magazines for like Dynamite, I remember, was one of them, aimed at a younger audience, just a younger audience interested in generic like movies and toys and stuff forth. And then you'd have magazines that were specialized for, like, for example, the movie industry, and those were for readers who were geared more for. They were aficionados of the movie industry specifically. But in both kinds of magazines, you'd have articles about interviews with the cast members and upcoming news. That was one of the few resources people had to learn about what was coming out soon and what was George Lucas coming out with. And you didn't have instantaneous news like that George Lucas blew his nose last week or something. It would take perhaps a few months for the word to get around, and things that he had said would appear in these magazines, but there weren't as many magazines as could fill an entire populace wanting to know the latest on what he's doing. So there would be time, there would have to be time. It would take time for people to, anyway, it would take time for people to learn about it, and not everybody all around would instantaneously have access to this knowledge. It would depend on certain people feeling like they're in the know because they had read this particular magazine, and they would gossip about it, and they would tell their friends, and word would get around. So consequently, not as much knowledge or updates would occur. They wouldn't occur as frequently as they probably do now, and as instantaneously, it seems. All right, so I remember T-shirts and magazines, and periodically on TV, especially with Star Wars, there would be a making of special. And keep in mind, there were only like really 3 channels, excluding PBS. There were 3 channels, and I'm not talking about cable television. Cable television was still something special just for people who were able, and afforded cable. Those 3 channels, NBC, CBS, and ABC, still dominated primetime television. If you had a television, basically you were watching those 3 channels, plus whatever cable channels you liked, you enjoyed. So there would be periodically making of specials, like, for example, like half an hour, or usually probably an hour. And I remember a number of them made about the Star Wars movies. And that was one of the few real resources people had to learn about these special effects techniques, and they were practical effects. I remember Jim Henson was coming out with the Muppet movies, the Muppet movie, and then the Great Muppet Caper, and then the Muppets Take Manhattan, the 3 primary ones, and then later on there were other ones after that, but those are the 3. And there were the 3 Superman movies, Superman, Superman 2, and Superman 3, obviously, duh. And then around 1987, Superman 4, and then basically that was it. And Superman was a big thing. You didn't have a focus on Batman Batman was just, I don't want to offend Batman fans because I know there were a lot of them, but in the 1980s, this is before Batman technically came out in 1989, but that was way at the end of the decade. Primarily, if you're talking about as superheroes and so forth, and the lead superhero, it was Superman, and he had the 4 movies, and Batman came from that TV show in the 1960s. Aside from those aficionados, I'm not talking about the ones who avidly read the comic books. I'm talking about like mainstream public awareness. And let me see. Yeah. Oh, and the 3 channels. I want to mention something very definitively. Because you only had those 3 channels, and because prime time started basically at 8 o'clock and ran through until like 10 o'clock, you basically had just 2 hours each weekday and weekend. The weekends could be modified, I guess, but you basically had from 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock, and then maybe 10 o'clock, maybe I'm pushing it, maybe 11 o'clock, but you had to have news like at 11 o'clock, and you had to have news like at 6 and 7 o'clock, really. You had to work around it. So in terms of prime time fictional entertainment, I'm talking about sitcoms. And at that time, there were, I don't want to say only because that would restrict myself, but what genres dominated television at that time? It was family sitcoms, and you really didn't have any other sitcoms. I'll venture to guess. I mean, somebody's going to be picayune and say, "Oh, well, there was a show in 1984 for 6 months or so." No, I mean just predominantly you had these genres. You had family sitcoms. You had, and I want to mention the popular ones. Give Me a Break. Earlier on, and then Facts of Life, Silver Spoons, Different Strokes, and one of my The Cosby Show was very popular. Bill Cosby was at least one of the heights, if not the most popular family sitcom at the time. That's why when Married with Children came out in early 1987. Its working title was Not the Cosbys, because family sitcoms were not to say that they were wholesome, sweet, white, pure, but it was still family viewing hour. And so you had to be careful. The writers had to be careful. The producers had to be careful about what they put on the air. So they wanted to emphasize that even though there were still slightly maybe off-color comedy or jokes or whatever, you didn't have that much wiggle room. You couldn't really offend that much of the audience. So when Married with Children came out, their working title was Not the Cosbys, and they were distinctly showing a dysfunctional family, as opposed to Family Ties, which actually I prefer Family Ties really over, I just favored it over The Cosby Show. But anyway, I think Family Ties was better written, and had a stronger substance to it than Cosby Show. Incidentally, Cosby Show, that wasn't the only show that he had. Before that, he had the Bill Cosby Show, which he played in the 70s. He played a coach of a basketball team, and then he also had another show, Magic Mark. He also voiced Fat Albert in the Fat Albert cartoon, and he had it wasn't just the Cosby Show. And I want to mention it wasn't just the Cosby Show, and before that, the Bill Cosby Show, and then after that, he had a show called Cosby. So I was wondering if what would the next show be called? I don't know. The show, I don't know. Anyway, all right, I wanted to mention that. But you had Newhart. Well, earlier on, you had the beginning. You had Different Strokes. You had Silver Spoons. You had Facts of Life, and Cosby Show came out in 1984, so I'll include that in there. And I said Family Ties already, and other shows that are skipping my mind at the moment. You had a lot of them. Benson. There were some workplace comedies like Benson, but even that was kind of a workplace family sitcom. And Night Court was the same way. It was a workplace family sitcom where it was a workplace, but the characters were sort of essentially a family in a home, like a workplace environment that was basically a home. And you had the sitcoms. Oh, and also Newhart and there was another Valerie, which became Valerie's Family, because she left. I'm thinking of some contract dispute or something or other, but she left. She was written out of the show, and they just called it Valerie's Family. But anyway, then you had. I was going to say something. Oh, okay. So that was one genre, and then you had dramas, which were more late at night. What I was talking about was something like 8 or 8:30, something. But then later on at night, you had, and there was no streaming. I want to mention while it's on, there was no streaming. You had to be sitting literally in front of your television and watching, or you'd miss the show. Sometimes you could have a video cassette player. However, you had to have one that was capable of recording. Now, when video cassette players came out, they could not record. It wasn't a given that you could record. You couldn't record anything. And then there was I think it even went up to the Supreme Court, but there was some dispute about a video cassette player being able to record, and I think the NBC, CBS, that those people rebelled against it, saying, well, they're copying our stuff, and they're in some sense, I guess the argument was they were somehow stealing. They were taking what we wanted to. We were providing this stuff, and they're somehow stealing it by recording it. And the movie industry probably played a big part in that, where if they were showing movies on television, somebody could record the movie, and then they didn't have to buy or rent it from the store, and there was a big deal about that. But essentially, the conflict was resolved by defining the video cassette player as simply doing a time shift, where it was enabling somebody who couldn't see the show when it was on the air because maybe they were out walking, they couldn't get home soon enough to be able to watch it. They could time shift it so they could simply watch it at a later time. That was the way they got around that. So then I would venture to say the pricier video cassette players could also enable you to record. And blank video cassettes weren't cheap. They got cheaper later on, but I want to mention that there were 3 common speeds. There was SP, which recorded took a whole cassette, and you could only fit 2 hours on. It depends on the speed that it was recording. It recorded, it would spin around the fastest, so you could only get 2 hours worth. It would put on the whole thing as much as it could fit, but it could only fit on 2 hours because it was running so fast. That was the best quality because it was, I forget exactly why, but something about how it was spinning fast enough, it was getting a lot of information, I'm not technical, especially this late at night. But then you had LP, which is 4 hours, and then you had I think it was 4 hours or 6 hours, and then, 4 hours, and then EP, which is the slowest, worst quality recording, and that would be like 8 hours or 6 hours. You could get a lot on there, but as people watching nowadays especially, somebody said that video cassettes have a reputation for looking like crap. I hope I can say that on YouTube, but looking like blech. How do you spell blech? I don't know. But looking like garbage. Well, somebody, I think on YouTube, pointed out that's probably because most of you are watching stuff that was recorded at the slowest speed. So so it's not the best picture quality when it was being recorded. So that's why SP does look pretty good. I mean, it's not crystal clear digital pixelate, pixel perfect image, because it was video cassette, but SP recorded on a good quality video cassette recorder looks pretty good. Crisp, especially when it's crisp and not run through a zillion times, played a zillion times. Okay, so so those were the common speeds, and video cassettes weren't that, blank cassettes weren't that cheap, and also cassettes of movies you would buy in the store weren't that cheap either. All right, so people, what did people wear? I should also mention in terms of television that it was a extra special night. No, sorry, I got off on tangent. In addition to family sitcoms, there were dramas. I think L.A. Law was playing at that time. There was Miami Vice. There were 1-hour dramas. And Star Trek The Next Generation was on too. But again, a lot of this was focused, a lot of the newer shows, the primetime new television shows that from season to season to season that people were eagerly looking forward to watching would show up in the on NBC, CBS, and ABC. The cable channels didn't really play. They played largely syndicated stuff and stuff from other countries or other regions, or reruns of shows from decades ago. That was like special. It was a special category, a special kind. Blah blah blah. I could put it in so many words. Basically, they weren't running the primetime shows. Those were NBC, CBS, and ABC. All right. So sometimes, to the frustration of younger kids, younger viewers, sometimes when there would be a media event, like something requiring the president to come on television and announce something, it would be usually around 8 o'clock, and it would interrupt something you were really watching and really enjoying. Keep in mind, there were only 3 channels. You didn't have internet. You didn't have any other source. The radio, somebody could play the radio, but usually what they wanted to do was watch the person talking, and they didn't just want to hear it on the radio. So Big Doofus or whatever would show up on air and talk, give his spiel, and then to the consternation of people watching, afterwards you had to have like news commentators comment on what they just watched the person, the Big Doofus, talk about. Okay, so after about what felt like 2 hours, hopefully you're praying to whatever deity you may believe in, that it would end so that you could watch the rest of whatever show you were really enjoying before this thing interrupted it. And so anyway, because there were only those 3 channels, that was the essentially the only way the thing could be broadcast to as many people as possible. Okay, so in addition to that, let me see, what were people wearing? I've had to think myself. I sort of remember, I don't want to fall in the trap, like the retro trap of thinking of fashion as being extravagant in the 1980s. I remember it being very colorful. I remember sweatpants. I remember jeans. I sort of remember jeans. I remember girls sometimes wearing, I remember like things around like colorful. Now I'm speaking, keep in mind that I'm speaking from the experience of like an elementary school kid, but girls would wear like sort of, I want to say fluorescent or neon kind of colored, not that they glowed in the dark, but just like they were plastic, lightly colored, like bright colored plastic bracelets. And they would wear like sweaters. And if you really, well, do I dare say this? If you want to watch what people were actually wearing, do I dare say watch television from that time. I don't necessarily, because that may have been exaggerated, but okay, in real life, I remember sweaters, I remember sweatpants, I remember jeans, I remember shorts. It wasn't as exaggerated as I think people nowadays make the 1980s fashions out to be. But they were colorful. They weren't extravagantly colorful, but they were bright and they were cheery. Basically, cheery is the best way of putting it. Um, I can't think of oh, in terms of buses, there were regular buses. Oh, going back to television, it, if you missed a show, if you missed a program, there were reruns. We had to wait until the summer in order to watch them. And let me see. A big treat, at least as a kid, a big treat would be when they would, around Christmas time, around Thanksgiving, and somewhat around Halloween. Yeah, I guess Halloween, Christmas, Thanksgiving. In addition to the regular programs like Night Court and Silver Spoons or whatever, usually having a themed episode around whatever holiday was coming up, you usually also had a special, like a half an hour cartoon. And I remember the popular ones were Garfield and the Peanuts. There would be a Garfield Halloween episode. It was real. I think the best Halloween animated special, I think, was the Garfield Halloween special, and the Peanuts Halloween special is right neck and neck with it. It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, and they would be run every year, annually every year, and people fondly remember it. And I would venture to say that even though they had seen it before, they would probably watch it again year after year after year, because of that fondness for, or just enjoying it, seeing it again. Like you would put in a DVD of a movie you enjoy, you watch it several times. What else? I mentioned there were magazines. Maybe I'll do another one of these, what I would like to say something like time capsule things. How long are we? We're at 47. It's not that bad. 47 and a half minutes. I remember taking buses. I remember well, I don't want to get into prices really, because that would really date it. It's not really pertinent. Oh, the library system. Oh, yes, yes. You go in and surprise, surprise, when you go into a library, they only had books. I mean, they had other things, but you didn't have this sophisticated computer system, and that you were borrowing everything under the sun. There would be a card catalog. It would be maybe in the center of the room, and it would be several drawers high, and literally there would be several drawers, and you would pull out the drawer. First of all, yeah, well, okay, let me do that. You would pull out the drawer. If you wanted to find a book, it was called the card catalog system, you would have to keep track of the Dewey Decimal System number. The libraries still do it, but I wouldn't be surprised at some point in the near future they just do away with the Dewey Decimal System for some bizarre reason. So I'm just going to mention it here. Topics for books were numbered, probably by Mr. Dewey, whoever he was, but Mr. Dewey somewhere. And like the 100s was for this category. I'm hypothetically speaking, like gardening might be in 220s, and like fishing might be 230s, and like hobbies would be generalized as 200s. So you would have a card catalog system, and if I remember correctly, you would be looking up the book. Was it by the? It wouldn't make sense to be by the author's last name. It would be maybe by the book title. You would pull, in any case, you would pull open the drawer, and you would flip through, and there would be like what are called index cards, or cards. Were they like 3x5 cards, something like about that size? And you'd be flipping, and they would be they would take up the whole drawer, and you would flip through them, and they would give specific information like the title of the book, the year of the book, publication date of the book, I should say, and the author, and a little bit, probably a blurb about what the book is about, and the Dewey Decimal System number. And then you would, if you were polite, you would push the drawer shut, and you go and find it on the bookshelf. And inside every book would be a pocket, taped, fastened very carefully, taking up precious text that you wish you could be able to see sometimes on the other side if it weren't for that stupid thing pasted over it. But anyway, there would be a pocket, and then there would be another index card put in there. And in some sense, I'd venture to say it would be a duplicate of what you found in the card catalog system, in the card catalog drawer. But here it would give a listing of everybody every name that had signed out that book. And the person literally would write in, or be stamped or something, but the borrower, like myself, would write on the card. It would be listed like this person did it first, and then this next person, and this next person, this next person. Like, you know, when you're given a sheet and you're signing in or signing out of somewhere, you know, usually it's listed, so you put your name in the bottom line right below where the person previously signed it. So it was the same way here. You would sign your name, and then you would put the date when you were taking the book out. And they were, I guess, a good library, or any a competent library, would be relatively strict on when the library book was due back, and they would keep records. I remember something like there were two cards, one card that they kept, and then another card, if I remember correctly, was kept in that pocket when you took the book out. You would take the book out with that card in it, but somehow they had another card that would keep track of when the book was taken out. And there was some level of computerization, so they were able to keep records pretty well. I think they kept records very well, really, given that system, given what the system was capable of. All right, speaking of computers, computers weren't flat screens. They were somewhat like TV sets, in that they were somewhat heavy, and they looked about the same as a television. In fact, some computers hooked up to a television. Like I had a TRS-80, which was Radio Shack's effort at computers. You had Apple Inc., Apple Computers Inc., but aside from that, you had IBM, International Business Machine, and you had other computers. Not many people, as is the case today, the majority of people are not Apple computer users. They use other computers, and you didn't have a mouse. That was the big innovation of the Macintosh, the Apple Macintosh. Well, first of all, somebody's going to point out in the comments. Hopefully, somebody will add comments. But you had Apple computers, and in 1984 or 1983, I don't know, somebody's going to be nitpicky. Somewhere in there, 83 or 84, they came out with the Lisa, which took an invention that was developed by Xerox. They borrowed it or took it, basically. It was the mouse. It was, I can't really, I was going to pick up my mouse, but it was the what was called the graphic user interface. Before that, you just had a keyboard, and you had to type commands, and that's probably the major reason why you had people who were good at computers being termed nerds or geeks or weirdos, because they and characterized as being very finicky, and it was sort of like computer programming was this special wizardry and magic that the average person didn't know how to do. And those people who could be able to work with computers were on a different, class or level. They were like sort of like magic wizards. And then with the advent of the mouse, where you could just click, you didn't have to type 10 go sub B11 and then type specific commands, a whole list of commands in order to get an image of a ball bouncing to music. I mean, it took a lot of commands and making sure you type the command exactly right. With the mouse, you could simply move the cursor around and just double click on something. And then the Lisa came out, and then I venture to say shortly after that, the Macintosh came out. And there was the Apple IIc and so forth. And my estimation, revolutionized and simplified the computer use, how people interacted with computers and used computers as a tool. You also had, video game home systems. I'll mention Nintendo, because the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, because that was the 1980s. It came out in 1985, and before that you had Atari 2600 and Atari 5200. Those were gaming consoles. It was about the size of a keyboard, maybe a bit larger, and you would plug it into your television, and you would change the channel to some odd channel that wasn't playing NBC, CBS, or whatever. It was just an odd channel, and it would switch over, so you would be getting the feed from the gaming console, and these were simple graphics, but they were fun. And from the point of view, from the experience, first-hand experience of a kid at that time, you didn't need to imagine fancy graphics and three-dimensional rotational graphics. It was like Super Mario. It was like you basically had an 8-bit character jumping around, and it was more about the strategy and skill, trying to avoid spikes or creatures bobbing around and so forth. And now you had the advantage of playing games at home rather than having to go to the arcade. Although people still went to the arcade throughout the 1980s and probably into the early 90s. I'm confident, early 90s as well. All right. I remember comic books. You still have comic books. I mean, they were just cheaper, and they were on regular paper. It wasn't very expensive paper. I remember in the early 1980s, mid 80s, I remember 75 cents for a comic book, and then $1. It was really big to have it be $1 around early 90s. And that's the early 90s. That dollar comic book was clearly a step up. The color, the quality of the ink was much brighter, more vivid. I just want to say more vivid. That's the biggest contrast. What else? I'm starting to draw a blank on what else, but I'll certainly come back. I'm confident I'll come back and have more to say. But I want to record this for the sake of future generations, and just maybe people who are my age who are nostalgic and maybe could point out, what things did I leave out? What major things did I skip out? Tell me in the comments. Thanks. Bye. Oh, as usually was the case, I forgot to mention two things. I want to talk about phones, and I want to talk about music. Now, in the 1980s, you still had records, large, I guess about this size. They were discs, thin. I hope you know what a record looks like, with a hole in it, and there would be record players. Those were still being sold and still in the mainstream. And if you could afford it, you could buy in the later 1980s. You could buy. I'd like to know really when CDs really became affordable for people. But anyway, you could buy a smaller version of this record. It's called a compact disc or a CD, and those are still sold in music stores and record stores. and they were mainstream. You could go through and flip through cardboard. There would be large cardboard sleeves, and if you're going into a store, you would see like boxes laid out in boxes. You'd see, usually in alphabetical order, you would see large cardboard sleeves, thin sleeves, and then you'd flip through and slide out. Well, once you bought the record, but you would take it home and you would slide out the actual record from the cardboard sleeve. Should be, I'm guessing, like this. It's been a while since I've actually held a record, but something like this big. And CDs were a smaller version, and they were had a more silvery shine on them. But okay, what is a record for those people who don't know? It would be a large disc. You'd have a record player, and the arm. It would be imagine like a square narrow. Not it wasn't very high, but like a square platform, and in the middle there was a rotating plate. I'll call it, with a spoke going right up, and you would put the record on, and there would be a hole in the record that would fit through this. I know people are making jokes right now. This is a great photo op moment, but anyway, a thumbnail moment. But anyway, goes right over the spoke, and then you would turn a switch, and the record would start. It would start spinning. The plate would start spinning the record at a certain speed. And it was a big deal to note what speed it is, RPMs, 33 and a third, or whatever. And the record would have grooves, and there would be tracks, like a race horse track. There'd be basically, how do I put it? Like rings. I'll just call them rings. There would be rings in the record, and a ring on the outside, and then a ring slightly inner, and a ring slightly closer to the center, and another one even closer to the center. And as the record played, the arm on the record player that juts out would have a needle, and it would be a very sensitive needle, and you didn't want to jump around and bump the record player, because it would at the very least, it would jostle the needle, and you couldn't hear it. It would stop playing, or it would might bump it off the record. Worst case scenario, it might actually, I would guess, probably scratch the record. You didn't want to do that. But the needle would bump, as I understand it. It would bump. I'm not a record scientist, but it would bump as against the grooves. The bumps would actually bump the needle up and down and so forth, and that would cause sounds in the record player so fine-tuned that would replicate the voice of the person, and talking usually these would be music records. So that's how you could replicate sound, and that's how would enable the record player to play music. And CDs are almost a whole other thing, but it's basically light, as I understand. It's basically light doing the same thing as what the physical needle is doing. One major difference in technology between the 1980s and essentially what you had in the 2000s and later on was that in terms of special effects and in terms of actual equipment, was that the actual equipment we had in the 1980s was physical. There was the level of computerization hadn't been achieved. In fact, there's a toy car based on the TV series Knight Rider, and there's a channel called Retro Blasting where they talk about 1980s culture and toys specifically, and TV shows and popularity in the 1980s. And it's a retro, nice nostalgic retro channel. And when they were trying to fix that toy car kit, I mean, the toy car, the car was literally named Kit because that was the name, that was its name in the TV show Knight Rider. It came with an action figure of Michael Knight, the driver, and it was advertised as being able to speak several different phrases in the actual Kit voice that you'd hear in the TV show. Well, and a lot of toys had this big, amazing feature that, you know, when it could actually say phrases. Now it's probably more commonplace because you have a lot of miniature digital, you know, miniature technology, computer technology. But at the time, that was a big deal. You know what they found? They did not find like any microchip or whatever. It was literally a small record player that would play one of various different phrases each time you played it. Literally, there was a record player within the car, and that was it. No computer, no special computer miniaturized technology. It was it. It was a record player inside it. I was even astounded by that, and I grew up in the 1980s. But there was there's a game show called one of my favorites called Press Your Luck, and Michael Larson was famous for, well, became famous. He did something that even I thought at the time, this was 1984, I thought at the time, but of course I couldn't get tickets to be able to go on the show, but even I realized this. Each contestant could press a pause button, and on the screen there were prizes, there were boxes going all around the game board, and prizes were lighting up and so forth. And it would only one square at a time would be lit, and when you paused it, you would get whatever was in the box that was lit at that one time. So hoping that it wasn't a whammy that would take all your money, and you have to start all over again accumulating money. But Michael Larson watched show after show after show and figured out there are only 7 sequences, because when the programmers were designing the game, that was probably the limit of what they could do at the time. 7 different possible sequences, and it would just go back running one of the 7 each time. And now when they came out with the Whammy show or whatever, there was a 2000 something incarnation of it, and they had a whole board that had lots of different squares, and it was virtually, you know, it was much more difficult to do what Michael Larson had done. So that's an example of how limited the technology was. It was that bridge between real needle and thread, brick and mortar, and computer technology. It was right. The 1980s was right in that bridge period. So that's another interesting aspect. I want to talk about phones. There were no, of course, somebody's going to point out cell phones. I guess I should point out cell phones, but those were for rich people. Those were, if you had a cell phone, first of all, it was a huge block of a thing you actually held, and it was a gadget, a large gadget you held, and those were for rich people, and people with a cellular phone in their car, that was for really rich people, and the car was really nice and really expensive, and Beverly Hills and Rodeo Drive and so forth. Like that's why it was a big deal for Richard Gere's character in Pretty Woman to have a cell phone and so forth. But for the common everyday person, there would be a model either fastened to the wall or on a table. And earlier on, when phones came out, from what I've heard, people actually had to pay for the color of the phone. It was really ridiculous. But you had a long thing that you would call a handle, and then on either end, I'm hoping you've seen a phone, older phone before. You had 2 half spheres, and you would pick it up and you talk into one end and hear in the other end, and there would be a button, sort of a loose feeling button on the base of the phone. You'd have a wire connecting the base of the phone to the thing that I was talking about that you would hold. And in earlier, decades before the 1980s, you would tap that in order to get from what I've heard, tap it in order to get the operator's attention, because there would be a switchboard operator somewhere, hopefully awake, to help in case there was some mechanical problem, and he or she would have. I was about to say she because I think stereotypically it was a woman, but in order to physically connect a phone signal from the person sending the signal to the person receiving the signal, you had to actually stick something into a hole in a wall, and that was done at a company somewhere, in a building somewhere. But you at home, I guess by tapping that, you could use. I've seen people do it on TV and in movies. I don't know if that even worked. Maybe I grew up in the 1980s, which was a later time when it wasn't such a big deal. But so it was a large. It was like the base would be about this size, and it wasn't very heavy, but it came in different colors, and there were some fancier designs for phones. Like there was a famous Garfield phone that I really liked. There were a few Garfield phones that I really liked, at least 2 models, and you could get them in different colors. Evidently, the color war won. The consumer won the color war, so you could. There were phones in various colors. It wasn't just, I think, black or whatever it came out. They first came out to be, and I remember Ma Bell was a big term. Ma Bell meaning like Mother Bell, which basically dominated the phone industry. And then was that AT&T? I can't remember what company. I'm not up on that specifically, but I remember Ma Bell was a term meaning that they basically dominated the phone industry, and it was almost a monopoly. If it wasn't a monopoly, it was like an oligarchy. Only a few phone companies existed, and they controlled what you could get and what you could not. It was really restrictive. And then there was pressure put on, and then companies were split up, and there was more competition. And then you had Sprint and MCI and AT&T and all these different competing companies, and that probably not only brought the price of phone connections down, phone subscriptions down, but yes, you had to pay for subscriptions for phone service. And there would be phone books. Oh yeah, thick, heavy phone books. You didn't have to, from what I recall, you didn't have to pay to have your name and address and phone number listed in the phone book. You had to pay to have it actually removed. It's kind of a clever way of getting one over on. No, I mean, we have control. We want to list every person's name everywhere. But anyway, there would be thick phone books, and for no cost to you, the town or the phone, there would be a truck going around and delivering new phone books. I don't remember what time of the year, maybe the fall or something or other. They would deliver the new phone books to basically every house, and you would keep the phone book typically by the phone so that you could look up a person's phone number. There was no way of recording any information aside from later, sophisticated mobile phones or cellular phone. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the basic phone that you pick up. It has a receiver. There was no way of recording phone numbers in there. So it was basically a matter of having a notepad where you'd buy, a regular notepad, and you'd buy and write down notes. You would write down a list of favorite phone numbers, or it's a matter of looking it up in the phone book. And this is a thick phone book. The very first part was, I think, the white pages. No, the first section was the white pages, and then the second section towards the back of the book, dominating most of it, I think. Was the yellow pages. Now it's for business. The white pages was residential, and those would be friends and family, just regular homeowners would be in the white residential section, and then the blue section, I think, was at the very front of the book, and that was government listings. That would be like local, like fire, ambulance, hospital, police, and sheriff and sergeant, and so forth. That would be very front, and then a relatively thick white section for residential and a very thick section for yellow. So that's how phone books and those are. I wanted to get that in there. Okay, now is the end of the video. Okay, until next time.